There is no way you could find a single critical word from Trump in related to Putin. And this is the best indication that, unfortunately for the United States, he actually is a Russian asset, and he would do exactly what Putin would tell him to.
Welcome to the Black Sky. Our guest today is Yuri Felshtinksy, a historian, a specialist on special services of Russia and Soviet Union. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Recently, the world was shocked when they heard the news on Alexei Navalny's death. But was the world as shocked when they heard about Litvinenko, when they heard about other people murdered by Putin?
Well, they probably were shocked in 2006 when Litvinenko was poisoned, especially because he was poisoned with a new kind of drug, polonium-210, radioactive poisoning. They might be shocked as well when Skripal was, murdered or attempted to be murdered. We still really do not know what's going on with Skripal. No one confirms that he died, but we've never seen him since poisoning. But again, the case of Skripal was interesting because he was exchanged by the Russian government. This was the Russian government which released him to Great Britain, and then they poisoned him anyway, right? And Navalny case is also, of course, unique for many reasons. First of all, they tried to poison him in 2020, and the fact that he survived is a miracle. This was due to a pilot's decision not to proceed to fly to Moscow. If he would do this, and that's what he's supposed to do by law, Navalny would be dead by the time they arrive to Moscow. But he, landed in the first available airport, and that's why Navalny was survived. Then of course he was recovering in Germany, and then he made a decision to come back. Probably the majority of people who know something about Russia, the Russian government, the state in which the country is now, would think that this was extremely risky decision, and that there would be a very good chance that he either might be arrested or killed. Indeed, they arrested him, they sentenced him to 19 years in prison, and then they were keeping him in prison, constantly worsening his conditions, what is very important because, there are some prisoners in Russia who are under arrest, who are in prison, but they keep them in comparatively safe conditions for the reason. In case of Navalny, they purposely worsening his conditions every month, every week, every day. So it's not surprising that he's dead. There is an information coming. I do not really know if this is so or not. We probably will know sooner or later that there was an exchange operation planned, and that he is supposed to be exchanged for a special service, Russian special services officer who was involved in a murder of a Chechen political leader in Berlin. I do not know whether this was prepared or not. There is a possibility that they killed him so they would not have to exchange him. In other words, that they were in a hurry to kill him before the exchange would take place. So this is also a possibility. But one way or another, Navalny was a rare case of a person who competed with Putin for the position of president of Russia. There were actually two known cases, Boris Nemtsov and Navalny. In both cases, they paid for this desire with their lives. Nemtsov was killed in February of 2015, and Navalny now.
For sure, Boris Nadezhdin is not going to compete with Putin for the post of the president.
Precisely. This was a Kremlin control operation when they select several people to officially and formally compete with Putin during the elections, because by law it has to be more than one person. You cannot by law in Russia have just one candidate for the position of presidency. But these are all like fixed matches, just you need to have at least two fighters on the ring, right? But even this did not work the way Kremlin expected, because Nadezhdin made a very simple statement. His program basically was, I'm against the war. And somehow even this started to provoke some reaction from citizens. It's not that this would be dangerous for Putin, taking into account that this is the FSB, and really the FSB, which controls elections, because they are responsible by law for the computer which counts votes. There is not another country in the world where the FSB or the state security would be responsible for computer. So they control the computer, and there is also a law which allows the remote participation. What is actually good law in a normal country, but in Russia, this allows to those people who control the computer to add any amount of votes of those people who did not come to vote, and there are a lot of them usually in any country for a candidate of Kremlin candidate. So there is no way, of course, Putin would lose those elections, but nevertheless, this uncontrolled reaction, especially because some of those people who were voting for Nadezhdin against the war were abroad, and this is even more difficult to control. So that's why they took him down from the list.
Do you think the presidential elections in Russia can change anything?
No, and indeed, if you ask me, I do not claim that I'm right in this position. I think I probably would argue that people should not participate in those elections, because participation in those elections creates impression that there are elections in Russia, while there are no elections. And again, the problem is that the Russian population, whatever they really think, and it's questionable what they really think, they're not able to influence this process one way or another. And we would never know how many people really supported Putin, how many people voted against Putin, and we even would not know how many people voted for one or another of those fixed Kremlin candidates, right? Well, one of them, of course, is of the Communist Party, a candidate of the Communist Party who traditionally participates as well. But anyway, we will never know real results. And we had a case, well-publicized case of elections in Belarus in 2020 when the majority of population, and this became known, the majority of population were voting against Lukashenko. It did not change really the fate of the country.
But people do vote. They go, they vote. So maybe they support Putin. Maybe they support war. Maybe Russian people are not ready for change.
Well, these, I think, are different questions. I would not be surprised if we find out that the majority of people support the war. But Russia lives in a format of open borders. The borders are open. And we know that a lot of Russians who are, for one or another reason, and those reasons might be different, are not happy with what's going on in Russia, they left. And you see them in Warsaw, just around you probably, because the second language after Polish or on the streets of Warsaw is probably Russian. This might be Russians, of course, or Russian-speaking people from Ukraine, from Belarus, but from Russia as well. So number one, a lot of people left, and really a lot, because I have to tell you, I'm in Warsaw from time to time, and 5 years ago, you basically would not meet Russian-speaking people in Warsaw in quarters, right? And now it's a major language. So Russians were leaving. Some of them are not happy because the war is going on. Some of them afraid that the border might be closed. Some of them are afraid to be drafted to the army. Some of them just do not believe in Russia anymore and would like to live somewhere else, right? But some of those who left, the majority probably, statistically speaking, as in any other country, probably the majority of people maybe do not care. And the minority probably actively supporting the war. I mean, what's happening in Russia is probably a proof that the majority of people who are in Russia do not oppose Putin. We might discuss why this was happening and what would be the reason for this absence of opposition to Putin. But we know that the opposition is comparatively small. That the amount of prisoners, political prisoners in Russia, again, is comparatively small. It's for each particular family, it's a tragedy, but we're probably talking about several thousand of political prisoners in Russia. We see that the protests in connection to Navalny, again, are comparatively small. They're much smaller than they were like several years ago when some political leaders were managed to organize protest movement in Russia. So for practical purposes, there is no opposition in Russia, right? But this does not really indicate that there is a deep belief in what Putin is doing, but it indicates that the majority of people in Russia do not really believe in political struggle, inability to change something. A lot of them emigrated. We really do not know the figure, but it's a lot. So unfortunately, I would not count on a support coming from inside. I do not expect Russian opposition to achieve a certain critical level when it would become dangerous for the state, for the government, when it would bring the change of the regime. I think this is not going to happen.
So do you think there is any chance to change the regime, to change Putin, to change this collective Putin, I would say, because it's not only him, right?
Right. First of all, and this is very important that you mention this, because that's precisely my position. I am afraid the problem is much bigger than just Putin. We are not dealing with dictatorship. We are dealing with collective dictatorship. And it's, of course, important to change a leader in a country like Russia if he's ruling for 24 years. And if something happens to Putin tomorrow, and, we always hope for this, unfortunately, but we always hope for this, but unfortunately, it's usually not happening to dictators. But if something happens to Putin tomorrow, this would bring some changes in Russia, for sure. I would not be sure that Russia would change the objectives of the policy of the state. I do not think they will stop the war in Ukraine, etc., etc., etc. But this might bring some changes, right? But again, this is collective Putin, and the problem is much bigger. And we have a situation when, for the first time in history, and this is really the first time in history, the state security as institution is running the country. And we have some indications and proofs that that's precisely how this is. For example, we know from Putin himself that the order to invade Ukraine in 1914 was made not by the Russian parliament or the cabinet of ministers, but by three people, Putin, Patrushev, and Bortnikov. Patrushev, of course, is former director of the FSB, and now he is the chairman or secretary of Security Council, and Bortnikov is current director of FSB. So there are three directors of the FSB who are making decision to invade Poland. There were two, of course, military personnel as well.
Ukraine.
To invade, I'm terribly sorry, to invade
Not
Ukraine.
yet, I hope.
To invade Ukraine. Gerasimov, who is the chairman of the general staff, and Shoigu, who is minister of defense. But these are technical, people who have no choice but to support the decision. The same three people made the decision to invade Ukraine in 22. Patrushev, Bortnikov, and of course Putin. So I think it's fair to say that this is the FSB which is making critical decisions in the Russian Federation. And unless we find the way to change this structure, right, we shouldn't expect anything good coming from Russia. Now, I wrote a book which was published in Poland, by the way, as well. I think that Polish title is From Dzerzhinsky to Putin,
Yes,
but this is basically the history of the FSB taking power in Russia and successfully taking it by 2000, when Putin was installed as the president. And I wrote in that book which was published in 21 in Russian and Ukrainian before the war of 22, that Putin created a very stable regime for himself in Russia, and he would be able to stay the president until 2036. That's what he promised to Russians, that he will stay as president until 2036, and they introduced special laws allowing him to stay as the president until 2036. So he might be president until 2036 unless he starts a major war. Then the regime will collapse, Russian Federation will collapse, and Putin will be gone. And that's precisely what happened in 22. And I think, of course, this was a critical decision for Russia to start this major war, because this is not just the war against Ukraine, this is actually the war against the Western civilization. And I think as a result of this war, they will collapse. The problem is that we do not know how long this will take and how the escalation of this conflict will go and what price we would have to pay for our victory. But after 2 years of war in Ukraine, initial plan, which was actually built on capitalization, that Putin did not expect actually to fight in Ukraine. Putin expected to accept capitulation of Ukraine. Sorry, I said capitalization. So this was the idea, that Putin would invade Ukraine, Ukraine would capitulate, Putin then would proceed quickly to Moldova. We have to remember that by February of 22, when they invaded Ukraine, Belarus was already occupied. We kind of missed it, right? But after Lukashenko lost election in 2020, Russia actually occupied Belarus, right? So the idea was that they would quickly invade one country after another, like kind of blitzkrieg, that everybody would capitulate because no one would be willing to fight because it's risky and dangerous and bloody. And this plan failed. Now, this plan, I have to say that everybody was expecting this, that the Ukraine would capitulate. Putin was expecting this, the West was expecting this, the United States was expecting this. But the plan failed because Ukrainians started to fight. And they started to do this quite successfully. And I have to tell that mainly due to Poland and the Baltic states, the Europe very quickly managed to assist Ukrainians in this fighting. Now, after 2 years of war, the plan changed. And I think Russia is now in a permanent war, meaning that they rebuild the state, the Russian state, the way that they would be able to conduct this war forever. It's a positional war where they are not able to proceed very quickly. At the same time, it seems to be they have enough supply of weapons, they have enough supply of money, and they have enough supply of people. And, reading and listening what the Russian leaders are saying, it seems to be that they are planning to conduct this war really as long as possible. As Medvedev was saying, Dmitry Medvedev, the former president, if it would take us dozens of years to destroy Ukraine, we will fight for dozens of years. And I think he is sincere, meaning that, again, Russia is now in a format when it's able to conduct this war for a very, very, very long time, because the West, unfortunately, is applying wrong strategy to this war. Instead of planning to allow Ukrainians to win, but for this they have to give them offensive weapons and allow to use these weapons against the territory of the Russian Federation, they are supplying Ukraine with limited amount of weapons and do not allow Ukrainians to use these weapons against territory of the Russian Federation.
Do you think that in this case, with this limited supply to Ukraine, the West will have an opportunity, let me call it, to use those weapons against Russia when NATO is attacked?
Well, I do not think that militarily speaking, NATO is weak. This is not so. Indeed, again, after 2 years of war, what we see is that Russia doesn't really have enough ground forces to proceed with advances. And I know, of course, that, for example, German analysts published a report that they're expecting Russia to invade Eastern Europe in 25. I'm usually one of those people who are kind of crying in advance about the danger coming from Russia, but I do not think that Russia would be able to form another army and to have ground forces which are capable to invade Eastern Europe, especially because those ground forces would have to go through Poland, the Baltic states, and Finland. And these are countries which are, let's say, always were very skeptical about peaceful intentions of the Russian Federation and were psychologically always ready for the attack. So it's not going to be a simple war for Russia. What I'm afraid of completely different scenario. Again, I think in 24 it's going to be a positional war, and both Russia and Ukraine would not really be able to move further ahead. But in November of 24, we have elections in the United States. And as we all know, unfortunately, there is a possibility that the next president might be Trump. If Trump becomes the next president, what would happen on the 20th of January? On 21st of January, he will stop not just the assistance to Ukraine. This is not really a major deal. He will stop US involvement into European problems. I do not know if he would be able to withdraw formally from NATO or not. No one knows the answer to this question because the US Congress introduced a kind of law not allowing an American president to withdraw from important political military alliance. But unfortunately, Trump is very good in breaking any laws. And but even if officially United States would stay as a member of NATO, US might stop participation in any, again, involvement of the United States, including military involvement in European affairs. If this happens, Europe would lose American nuclear umbrella. If Europe would lose American nuclear umbrella, then there would be only two countries in Europe, France and the United Kingdom, who would have nuclear weapons. While in Europe, Russia and Belarus are two countries which in reality have nuclear weapons. So what I think might happen, and I hope sincerely that this is not going to be the case, that France, what historically they tend to do, would claim that they're not going to be involved. Russia, of course, is not going to strike from the territory of the Russian Federation. I do not think so. I do not think that they will strike with nuclear weapons against Ukraine. I do not think that they will strike with nuclear weapons against Europe. What I do think is that they would create an impression that this was Belarus, which strikes or would strike against Europe. And that's what I'm afraid of. So I'm more afraid of this than of ground invasion from territory of Russian Federation into Eastern Europe.
You have this mixed Russian and American perspective. And why do you think is this attitude of Donald Trump? Why doesn't he believe in NATO? Why does he want to stop this involvement of the United States? Doesn't he remember the Cold War, those times, as many of his peers do?
I think by now we know that there is a group of leaders of foreign countries who are pro-Russian for reasons which are known to us, or actually might be considered to be Russian assets. What on the language of special services means that they are, Russian spies. And I will give you several examples. People like Schröder in Germany, former chancellor. A lady, I forgot her name, but she is a former chancellor of Austria who actually defected to Russia some time ago and accepted the Russian citizenship. And again, we are talking about two former chancellors of Germany and Austria. Berlusconi, who died recently and who was extremely pro-Russian and was helping Putin to have roots in Europe among the right-wing political organizations, including, for example, a major organization in Italy, Northern League or Northern Alliance. Le Pen, of course, who is pro-Russian. Miloš Zeman former president of the Czech Republic, who was extremely pro-Russian, Viktor Orban in Hungary, who is very pro-Russian. So we do have a lot of leaders, who are pro-Russian or pro-Putin. And Trump is another one, and unfortunately, he is happened to be former president, and who knows, maybe future president of the United States. Now, it has, in case of Trump, it has its own history. He always had a major connection to Russia, to Russian money, and I do not know if this is the only reason. There might be some other reasons about we do not know. But what we have to accept, and it's difficult to expect, I know, because people are always expecting to see, proof, the kind of proof which might be introduced in a court. It's almost impossible to prove that somebody is working for Russia, that basically that the person is a spy or the person is a Russian asset. And this relates to Trump as well. And I will give you some, again, as a person who is specializing in secret services, special services. I would give you an example. Oleg Kalugin, of course, is a former Soviet KGB general, right, who lives in Washington, D.C. now. I talked to him about this, and he told me that this is to prove the recruitment is absolutely impossible task, right? There is another spy who lives in London, Oleg Gordievsky, who actually was recruited by British intelligence, and KGB suspected him of being, recruited and being a spy for the British intelligence. They investigated him for several months. They kept him in prison. They could not prove that he is a British spy. And then, of course, as soon as they let him go, he escaped to Britain. Again, my point is that if we would start to look for documents proving this, we will never find them. But what's important to, again, understand about Trump, that he would never say a single bad critical word about Putin. A single one, under no condition. Because ironically, this is the basic rule of recruitment. You are not allowed to criticize your handler. And that's why every time somebody is asking Trump a question about Putin, like, well, what do you think about Putin's invasion of Ukraine? Or he's a smart guy, right? Or what do you think about Navalny's death? And Trump gives a completely, strange reply, not even mentioning Navalny, because Putin doesn't mention Navalny. He never pronounces his last name, right? Again, Putin hates Navalny so much. That's what he is doing. You may ask Trump about Crimea, and he would avoid the answer. You would ask him, and this was done, about Litvinenko case, murder of Litvinenko, and again he would say something that it's not known who killed him and who killed whom. So my point is that there is no way you could find a single critical word from Trump related to Putin. And this is the best indication that, unfortunately for the United States, he actually is the Russian asset, and he would do exactly what Putin would tell him to do, or what Putin would expect him to do.
Well, as we said, it's difficult to prove someone's a spy unless you catch them red-handed, as the spy in Italy, exchanging documents, secret documents for money from Russia intelligence officer. But I would like to ask you. You mentioned defectors. I would like to ask a defector from the other side. So the pilot of the helicopter from Russia who flew to Ukraine, and he was found dead a few days ago in Spain. So those tentacles of Moscow killing people, they are still present in Europe strongly.
Well, of course, the answer is yes. But I would say that the killings are happening in two cases. Well, in three. One is the person is competing for power with Putin, and for this you do not have to be abroad, right? Again, this is a case which we mentioned of Nemtsov and of course, of Navalny. The second case is when, from the point of view of the Russian government and the FSB, and honestly, this is almost the same now because these are the same people, if you conduct treason. And this, of course, relates to people who are working for special services or military. And this, again, would be the case of Litvinenko, Skripal, and that helicopter pilot, right, who, of course, conducted treason because he flew with his helicopter to Ukrainians. Well, and then, of course, when big money are involved, and that's why we sometimes, hear about strange stories of somebody or jump from whatever his hotel room, or the entire family is killed for unknown reasons. This is usually connected with big money issues. Otherwise, again, we have to accept the fact that Putin, besides the wars, right, and there were two major wars, two wars with the Chechen Republic and the war, and two wars with Ukraine, right? The Russian government does not kill people yet, the Russian citizens. On the level, Stalin used to kill them, for example, when he was killing by millions. So I think Putin still has the way to go further and further and further. And I think that's what might be happening. We will see that he will kill again with time more and more and more and more people. But he still has, a road ahead of him.
Are you observing the current situation on Polish-Ukrainian border with all those agricultural protests and?
Well, yes, and
do you think there is some Russian element involved?
I'm sure there is, but the question is how critical that Russian element is. It's like with the elections in the United States, for example, with Trump. Are Russians involved? Yes, of course. But we have to say that they are involved in any elections and in any activity. And there is for example, a text published by Dmitry Medvedev in his Telegram channel. And I really love to read them because he's very outspoken about plans of the Russian government, while Putin is kind of not talking too much, usually. Medvedev is printing those texts like at least once a week. And one of his last texts was about the new approach of the Russian government. He's saying that the Russian government now is trying. It's not that they were not doing this before, right? But they were not claiming that they were doing this openly. And now he's saying that the Russian government will start to influence internal politics of the countries and would openly cooperate and collaborate with any anti-American movements, either from the left or from the right, conservative movement, national movements, etc., etc., etc. So this is, by the way, a major difference between the approach of the Soviet government and approach of the Russian government. Soviet government usually would cooperate with the left political spectrum, while Putin actually is ready to cooperate with any political spectrum as long as the spectrum is basically anti-democratic or anti-American or anti-Western. And so, yes, of course, they're using all weaknesses. And again, we had claims before. This particular claim was made by Patrushev that they are trying to create artificial hunger for the third world, like first of all Africa. So migrants from Africa would be forced, of course, because they would like to live, to try to move to places like Europe. This would create uncontrolled immigration. This would create chaos in Europe. And then, of course, European, political parties or Europeans would, vote for right political parties because these were anti-immigrant political parties, right? It's a long way to go, but they're not in a hurry, right? And that's what we are going to see. I think. I'm sure it's possible to find the way to avoid this economic crisis, which is related to the fact that Russia blocked its export of Ukrainian grain through the water, and the Ukrainians are kind of forced to try to sell it by train to European country, and on the way this grain is sold to speculators who are trying to gain through the sale of cheap grain. I mean, I think it should be coordinated, meaning that I think that the Europeans have to build a plan what to do with this. And I'm sure at the end it would be, cheaper for everybody and better for everybody, and this would avoid scandal and this would avoid conflict. But at the end, I do not think that there will be or might be a conflict between Poland and Ukraine for a very simple reason, that Europe is now put in a position when Ukrainians are holding the fort. It's not because they love to do this. It's because they have no choice. Again, because the Russian government states this like every day, that they're going to really destroy Ukraine and kill all Ukrainians. So Ukrainians know that they have no choice. Countries like Poland and the Baltic states know that they have no choice but to help Ukrainians. Because as soon as Russia is done with Ukrainians, they will move to Moldova, and then they will move to Eastern Europe. And even Europe does not have a choice, because they know that if Ukraine is broken and if the resistance there is broken, then Russia would move into Eastern Europe and then into Central Europe. So no one has a choice but actually to help Ukraine.
Just one question to end. You were born in Russia, but the majority of your life you spent in the United States. Do you want to return one day to Russia?
Well, look, and it's interesting that you're asking this question, because I was thinking about this 2 days ago, literally. I am 67 years old, so let's be practical. Let's say I have 20 years of active life. Maybe less, but who knows? Is there a chance that Russia would become a normal country within the next 20 years? No. And I will tell you why I think the period about which we are talking is much longer. I do not believe that Russia will end this war itself. I think Russia will escalate this war into the next level. I think as a result of this escalation, NATO would have to be involved sooner or later openly. And I think this war would become very, very bloody. There is a way to finish this war very quickly, and I do not really think that this is my fantasy. I think if you give Ukrainians offensive weapons, contemporary weapons, in the quantity which they think they need, and if you allow Ukrainians to use these weapons against the territory of the Russian Federation, and first of all against Moscow, what is very important, because Russia is a country where everything is concentrated in Moscow, and everything depends on Moscow. And a situation when Russia is, firing missiles into Kiev, and Ukraine is not responding with similar attacks against Moscow is ridiculous. And if this happens, if Ukrainians would at one point would allow to strike against Moscow, this war will be over in 2 weeks to 2 months. And Russia would lose this war. But Russia would be able to become a normal country after 2 events would happen. First, Russia is defeated in this war. And second, the world will, mainly Europe, will kind of pardon Russia for the crimes committed during this war. And we know from the German case that this actually took probably 80 years. So we are very far away from a moment when Russia would become a normal country, and when we will pardon Russians for crimes committed. And I do not know how many dozens of years this would take Ukrainians to forget what was happening, right? So this is not 20 years, unfortunately. It's a longer period.
Thank you very much for this interview.
Thank you.